Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar. We're going to give everyone just a few more minutes to trickle on in here, so we'll go ahead and get started in just a few minutes. Okay, I think we can probably go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone again for joining today's webinar, using research to build the future of global experience. Really excited to chat about this today. I think most people on this call who have worked in localization, worked in translation, worked with linguists before, but it's not too often that you get to peek behind the curtain a little bit and see what's going on, and really see how all of this is this research and technology that goes into building these systems can really help build the future of global experience. So we'll do a couple quick housekeeping items and then we'll dive in. First and foremost, we want this to be as conversational as possible, and we want to hear from everyone on this call. So if you do have any questions, there is a Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. So please feel free to submit some questions. We've already gotten some ahead of today's call from folks as we sent out these invites, so really excited to cover those. But if you have any additional, please feel free to send them over. And then second, if you can't stay the entire time, if you weren't able to join in the first place, if you have colleagues and friends that wanted to have a watch, this will be recorded and we will be sharing it out. So feel free to send it out to everyone you know, and know that it'll be recorded and we'll send it out after the fact. So with all of that out of the way, I think we're probably ready to dive in. We'll do some quick intros. I'm Drew. I'm the Senior Content Marketing Manager here at Lilt, and have been with the company for a few years now. So I'm excited to always be able to lead these conversations on these webinars and really have some fantastic guests. But I'm especially excited for today's conversation because it's a fascinating topic and something that impacts not only us here at Lilt, but I think everybody else on the call. So Sai, I'll hand it over to you to do a quick intro, and then we can jump in.
Thanks, Drew. Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks for joining. My name is Sai Gauravajula. I'm one of the researchers here at Lilt. I grew up, just a little bit about me. I grew up in suburban Pennsylvania, right outside of Philadelphia's suburbs. I went to undergrad here at Villanova, and then made my way to the Midwest to the University of Michigan, where I got my PhD in computer science. And then I think it's a calling that computer scientists have to keep going west. So I ended up going to California, where Lilt is based. And sort of my background and what I studied in graduate school is really thinking about HCI, or human-computer interaction, specifically thinking about all of these really amazing technologies that are coming out with a lot of intelligence in them, right? A lot of AI built in, and really thinking about how we can provide guidance and support and build this into the interface to make the users' jobs a lot easier, which hopefully you'll find to be pretty relevant to what we're doing at Lilt.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thanks for the intro. I think hopefully folks will really find it interesting, but we'll dive right into the agenda. Today we're going to cover, we've got a lot to cover, how Lilt thinks about research. We'll move into understanding and analyzing linguists' behavior, moving on to training and learning from linguists. It's not just a one-way street. We want to make sure that we're helping them as much as they help us. Then really focusing in on using research to really further this idea of global experience. And then we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. Hopefully we can get to all the questions. Like I said, we already have a handful to go over, but want to make sure that we carve out some time at the end for folks to watch and ask questions. So with that out of the way, before we really dive in, I want to make sure we spend a couple minutes at the front here covering what is global experience in the first place. At Lilt, we talk a lot about global experience, but I think it's important to touch on this topic at the beginning because it kind of sets the stage for all of this and kind of everything beyond beyond just this topic. So it's no surprise to anyone here, the pandemic has kind of completely changed the way that the world operates, that the way that customers, buyers, sellers, companies, everyone interacts and engages with each other. So I want to put a graph up here on the screen. It's from a McKinsey survey from 2020, and I can only imagine it's increased since then. But we're living in a digital first world, and what used to be a primarily in-person, brick and mortar, different way of interacting with companies has changed a lot. And this graph shows the average share of customer interactions that are digital. So it's the way that buyers and sellers communicate and engage. It's the way that consumers engage with companies and brands. And you'll see about a quarter, dating back to 2017, 2018, about a quarter of those interactions were digital, which seems to make sense. It seems pretty on par with my experiences and what it seems like everybody else's experience were. Then as December 2019 hit, which is really when talks of this whole pandemic were starting, this number started to creep up and creep up. And by July of 2020, we hit 65%, which is nearly triple where it started. And it just goes to show that a lot of the way, like I said, the way that customers are engaging with brands and companies has changed a lot. And so what does that mean for us? What does that mean for companies? What does that mean for Lilt? What does that mean for everyone involved? Well, that means that the way that these customers experience a brand is very different than before. And really the most important part of that is language. While before it might have been easy to cater to mostly a local customer base, it's really different now. And customers all over the world can now access and engage and communicate with a brand. And this stat up here is actually from our State of Localization survey from last year. We interviewed and we surveyed over 900 localization leaders throughout the industry, and 91% of them believe that localization impacts the customer experience. And it's not really a surprise to anyone on this call, I'd imagine, but what it does mean is that this customer experience isn't just a local customer experience anymore. It's global. And that's how we talk about it here at Lilt, is this idea of the global experience. But language is still missing in a lot of ways from those conversations, and taking it from a fragmented, potentially unusable experience for folks outside of the language you might offer your services and products in, and making it fully interactive and engaging for everyone is super important. So with that, and with the shift to the digital first world, if you can call it that, is the content volumes are just increasing dramatically. And so this graph kind of just shows a little bit of the word volume that we've seen and that the world has been seeing over the last couple of years, and it's just increasing every month, every year. There is a max of what humans are capable of, though. Human translators and linguists, they're incredible, and they do some incredible difficult work, but there is a max capacity of what we're able to do. And so that's where AI and MT step in and kind of help fill that gap, and help us continue to reach those rising volumes of content. And so a lot of what we're talking about today is, how does that help? And how does MT, AI, how does all of that work with linguists to make sure all of this is going smoothly? And so this idea of global experience, and we'll come back to this at the end, but it's really important, and all of this research and technology is super relevant to this idea of taking your customer experience global and localizing as much as you can. So I wanted to give the quick primer on global experience before we jump in. So now that we have, I think it's super important to just frame all of this with how Lilt thinks about research. So Sai, I'm going to hand it off to you, because I know that this is your bread and butter, and you'll be able to speak to all of this really well. So I'll hand it off.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Drew. Yeah, I think building the context or setting the context for global experience is really nice, because, the projects that I'm going to talk about are just, if we think about like a day in the life of what a researcher at Lilt goes through, we're sort of working on our own projects, but then it isn't just working on projects for the sake of working on projects, right? It's towards this idea that we want to make the world accessible, right? We want it to be that language isn't going to encumber anybody. We can have this sort of amazing free flow of information. So within that, context of accessibility comes in the global experience. And so hopefully you get to see some of the projects we're working on, and sort of like chipping away at that amazing goal, right? Where we can all communicate without really having language barriers. Okay, I know that was like super duper like future amazing world thing, but bringing back to Lilt. So I'm really lucky to be working with some amazing colleagues, not just all across Lilt, but also in the research groups. So the way it's structured at Lilt, we have two sort of broad subgroups of researchers. We have the machine learning group, and their sort of bread and butter is really thinking about the algorithms, right? The actual neural machine translation models that go in for each of these language pairs, really thinking about what is the next best word that we can predict? How do we best translate a sentence? So they're really thinking about the cutting edge, state of the art for taking all sorts of information that's available, and then sort of converting that into really intelligent models. And then the group that I'm part of, which is the human computer interaction one, we're sort of thinking about, okay, how do we take all of the amazing work that the ML group is doing, and then presenting it in a particular way that, the translators can actually use. This is sort of like a two-way street, right? You can have the most amazing, intelligent MT algorithm, but if the platform isn't usable, it's not that great. Versus you can have the most amazing platform, very easy to use, intuitive, but if the suggestions that the computer is giving you aren't so great, then you're not going to want to use it, right? And so I think that sort of leads into the next part, which is we're not in our own individual silos, right? We get to really work with each other. And much like a research group you'll find in academia or academic institutions, for instance. It's super collaborative. So it's not that we're sort of staying in our own lane, but we're really thinking deeply about how do we make sure that this partnership between the professional translators, right, that are working with us, can also work really closely with the system itself. So with that said, I wanted to show like a really high level overview. I know there's like a lot of block diagrams here on this slide, but I just wanted to walk through sort of at a high level what actually happens when you use the Lilt interface. So as I had mentioned, the machine learning group, the first step is really getting a lot of data. There's a bunch of data sets floating around on the internet. Really, academic institutions use them, other researchers use them. And these data have been curated to sort of have a source language and a target language. And then you sort of have the sentence example in the source, the actual answer translation in the target. And so based on this data, what you can do is you can then train the neural machine translation models, right? And so this is what really goes into a lot of the machine learning group's efforts, is really thinking about how do we clean up this data? How do we find the best data? What happens if we don't actually have those, source to the target, like right answer sentences? Can we leverage information that's in other language pairs that are closely related? So all of this goes into the sort of the next part, which is the neural machine translation engine. And so Lilt's NMT models are trained with all of this data. We build really, well, I'm biased, but we think really awesome models, right? And so now we have that part ready. So then what happens next? Well, we hand it off to our platform, the Translate platform. It's deeply integrated. And then we have our professionals working on translating documents. And I think one of the cool things about the Lilt approach to document translation is it's not just the post-editing approach where we spit out what we think the answer is, and then sort of the translator's job is to be like, yes, let me fix these mistakes or something, right? I took French in high school, so I lost a lot of that, but even I would not find that all that great if all I had to do is look at a computer's output, right? And say, okay, let me fix this word or this word. Really what happens with our platform is translations are built interactively. So the machine has a translation suggestion for what it thinks the translation should be for a sentence. And then the translator sort of brings in their expertise, all of their years of knowledge, and they can actually work with the system to construct this translation, sort of word by word or phrase by phrase. And that's where you see this little loop happening, right? Where the translator can look at what the machine is suggesting based on what they've typed, and then they can either accept it or ignore it or sort of amend that suggestion. And the best part is this goes back into the neural machine translation model. So it's always learning, it's always updating so that it's learning about the customer, it's learning about the content, the particular way the translator likes to sort of do translation, right? So we can create all of these models that are getting better and better. They're more fine-tuned for the translation tasks at hand. And so the more you type, the more you sort of use the Lilt interface, the more intelligent it becomes. Okay, that said, of course, our aim, right, is the highest quality that we can achieve, right? That's what all the professional translators also sort of strive for, right? And so as part of this, we have a quality assurance step where we have reviewers sort of looking at the output from the work from before. And I'm not going to really cover this in this webinar, but one of the cool projects that the machine learning team is working on is something called neural auto review, where we have the same sort of training models, right? Or the same way that you train these models are now looking at the translations as they're being typed and saying, hey, I think this could be, there might be a mistake here. Why don't you check it? I think this is what the correction should be. And so that review process is now being baked into the translation part itself, which I think is pretty cool. And then all of this work that's gone into translation is then, produced for the customer. So this is sort of like the entire loop, right, at a high level, of course, for how Lilt ends up augmenting the localization process. So specifically for today, what I wanted to show off is the human side. So the human translator and the human reviewer side, which is, that's sort of my day-to-day work, is really thinking about how we can make Lilt sort of the best platform for the translators to be able to use. And so that's what the next step is the, I think the next slide, yeah, that's what the highlight is. So I think with that said, right, again, please feel free to ask questions if you have any. Now that we know what we're going to sort of focus on in terms of this entire overview, what I wanted to talk about are some of the methods that we use, right? So HCI, again, is human-computer interaction. Not the most creative field name, but it's pretty on point. It's literally, how do we get people to interact with computers in the best way possible? For us, it's about high productivity. It's about coming up with the best quality and sort of making sure that people are actually enjoying using these platforms, right? And so all of this sort of tools in our toolkit can be sort of broken down into these 3 high-level subgroups. We use quantitative methods where we think about numbers, right? We get all sorts of numbers and metrics like how fast people are able to complete documents. What are the accuracy rates? Are people making errors? If so, where? What are the word prediction accuracies, which is basically a measure of how well the machine translation models are working? What are they for each different language pairs? So we have the set of numbers that we analyze. At the same time, you can only stare at numbers so long before you figure out like, hey, why are people doing this, right? And so for that, we have qualitative approaches. So we interview our linguists, sort of really trying to pick their brains for trying to figure out, okay, what is your mental model of what you think is happening? We have something called a contextual inquiry, which I'll talk about later, where we observe linguists, in the wild, right, as they're doing their work and say, okay, why did you make this decision? Why did you make that decision? And then finally, it's all well and good to be able to talk to linguists and analyze data if we're not actually making changes for the better. And so here we design a whole bunch of experiments thinking about, okay, we think that this particular addition to the interface will help a lot. We can't just go ahead and do it and hope that people like it, right? So we have these things called A/B tests where we have some of our linguists use the old interface. Some of them are randomly put into a group that has the new interface. And then we can then analyze, okay, did efficiency go up? Did people actually enjoy using it? Is quality going up and so on? As well as general usability studies, right? Always trying to figure out this feedback, as Drew mentioned at the beginning. We're not just going to create a platform and then say, okay, here you go use it. We really want to hear back from our linguists to make sure that we're developing this platform, developing these tools that are actually going to be helpful and usable for them. So
Yeah,
that's basically that section. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it's always important to frame all of this around how we're thinking about this in the first place, because all of the work that you all do on the research team, that the product team is doing to build this, and it also, it makes its way into the rest of our teams, and how we engage with our linguists, how we then engage with our customers. It's really important that this is all clear, and most importantly, like, we're not hiding behind, like I said, we're not hiding behind a curtain, and we don't want to keep this stuff to ourselves. This is this is transformational, whether it's Lilt or not. It's just important for the industry and moving everyone forward. So with that said, I think moving into the next section, it's great that we, this is the way we think about it, and the two teams are working side by side. And there's, and I think we'll touch on this a little bit later. I know one of the questions that came in last week was about future projects. So I'm excited to hear the answer, because I was hoping somebody would ask. But this next section is also, I think it's one of the biggest and most important parts of this entire webinar, is just understanding and analyzing linguist behavior. Sai, I know you've mentioned already that a lot of this is, we can put into play what we think will work, but if we have no way of understanding how the linguists are actually using it, and what's working and what's not, it's kind of pointless. So I'll hand it back to you to touch on this, because I know it's something that's really interesting. So I'll move into the next slide so you can go ahead and get started.
Definitely. Actually, that reminds me of something that one of my professors in grad school would always talk about in one of my courses, which is, um, know thy user, for they are not you. And so that's sort of something that is prevalent, something that would always be careful to sort of live out, because I think I can develop the best interface or the UI or the user experience that I can, but it will fall flat on my face if I don't consider the user and actually, say, okay, how do you actually go use this, right? And I think that's even more critical for localization, because there is cultural context. There's a lot of nuance in the languages that, if I don't speak the language, I'm already sort of, it's a non-starter that I can develop something, without speaking to linguists. So with that said, right, something that's really important is trying to actually see what's going on in the world. And so the way that the HCI research team really thinks about this is, okay, how are linguists using this interface? What's actually going on? And so all we need for that are just two things. We need to keep track of mouse clicks, and we need to keep track of keystrokes. And I know it sounds really simple, but if you strategically place those logging elements in the interface, it's pretty incredible, all sorts of questions that you can answer. So, just from that sort of logging, we can understand we can not understand, observe a lot of linguist behavior, right? How often are they using the MT suggestions? Now we can come up with some quantitative analysis with that. What are ways that linguists are actually using to enter text? Is it just typing? Are they pressing the enter key to accept the linguist suggestion, the MT suggestions, right? Thinking about things like, here's a screenshot of the Lilt interface. Where are people spending their time? Does it differ for different customers? Is it different for different language pairs? Maybe some languages require a lot more searching through the translation memory or searching through concordance. So these are a lot of these nuances that we can understand by looking at these logs. A lot of the stream, it's basically a stream of data, where people clicked on the interface, where people typed. And based on this, we can create a bunch of these analysis scripts that will tell us these sort of numbers. Okay, before we would do this, it would be a very manual process. But then one of the researchers sort of on our team set up an amazing way to analyze all of this data by incorporating this tool called Superset. So the idea is that we take this UI and we hook it up to our databases where all of this information lives. And then once you sort of set that pipeline up, all of a sudden you're able to run these queries that are, about how often people are using the MT suggestions, where people are getting stuck, and so on. And at least for me, what's really fun is looking at the pretty graphs, right? And so I took, these are real data. I know you're probably looking and you're like, hey, wait a minute, there's no like y-axis and a little bit of the x-axis. Obviously, company trade secrets and all. I didn't want to give that away. And so I strategically cut those off, but this is still giving you an idea of what it is that we get to do, right? We get to look at heat maps for that particular question and say, okay, what's happening? What's the trend over time? What's the trend for the customer, for instance? Or we can do comparative analysis. Okay, this is the thing from before, and then here's that squiggly line. And then here's the thing that we created for the intervention. So what's the impact, right? Is it good? Is it bad? And so this is sort of the kind of analysis that we get to do. Again, all going back to the mouse clicks and the keyboard, right? And so it's pretty incredible what kind of information we can observe. But, remember I said there's only so much you can get from just watching people, right? Because you sort of actually have to do something more with that. But, like you said, Drew, this is a really good start. And all of a sudden, this kind of ability to look at what the linguists are doing, I think really helps us figure out our research agenda, and really helping us figure out how do we collaborate with our own internal teams? Do we talk to product? Do we talk to the production team? Do we talk to operations and so on? So it's really, really important that we're able to have this sort of I'll steal your phrase, Drew. This is the part we want to open the curtain, just for what the linguists are doing. That's all.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a nice segue into the next part of this webinar, which is, it's great that we can understand all these behaviors and see what how linguists are using the platform and what's working and what's not. But there is that crucial next step of what do we do with all that data? What do we do with that information? We mentioned it earlier. It's not a one-way street, and we can't make assumptions, and we can't just take this data and then say, great, nice that we have it. Those are some nice looking graphs. We have to do something with it. And so training and learning from linguists is a really key part of this entire conversation. And I think it's also, we touched on it a little bit before, we'll touch on it in the next section, but like all of this, even if it doesn't feel relevant to what you're doing as a company, managing localization, managing global experience, it's incredibly relevant, and we'll touch on that later. But I want to first get into this section because I think this is we're working on some really cool things, and it's cool to be able to share this stuff. So I'll give it back to you to talk about this section and cover,
definitely
how we deal with all this information now that we have it.
Yep. I also just wanted to add a quick note about like the section heading, right? Like, training and learning from linguists. I think one thing that I feel really lucky with is that localization is by definition something that has to do with culture and language and people and community, right? And so as researchers, it isn't just that we wake up one day and like, I don't know, sipping coffee or tea or whatever, and like there's a light bulb that pops up, right? That's, at least for me, that's never happened. And for what we do at Lilt, it's really talking with linguists, sort of better understanding what's happening, but also learning from the community at large. So looking at what other researchers are working on, right? Research is by definition a very collaborative process. Sort of learning from the cool things that folks in other academic institutions are working on, or other research groups are working on, and just keeping our eyes and ears sort of open and peeled. Every week we read research papers in the research group where we're trying to understand what is the state of the art in machine learning, what's the state of the art in HCI approaches when it comes to these AI platforms, right? And so it isn't just that, again, that we have some problem that we want to find solutions for, but it's always thinking about that. And it's not the same as the global experience that customers want to have, but it is very much like a process that's much bigger than just me or our group. So the first part of that is really talking to linguists, right? And so bringing it back to sort of what we get to do on a day-to-day basis. Let's say we observe that linguists are using the machine translation suggestions X% of the time, or maybe they're using the mouse where maybe there's keyboard shortcuts that are available, right? And so ways that we bring this information back to the linguist is doing live webinars. Actually, it's pretty surprising how well these work. It's almost like when you have people that work in a field that's very much about language and people and words, and you have that interaction with each other, it works really nicely, right? So we have these examples where we're like, hey, we get a lot of our linguists come together and we sort of open up a dialogue. I got to do a couple of live demos for some of these topics where we're like, hey, this is what we think the best practice would be for using the QA tool or using the concordance tool. And it's not just something that I came up with, because again, I would be terrible at this. I forgot all the French. I only know how to say I don't know how to speak French now. But best practices that our linguist community tells us that they found useful, and we reflect it back to the community at large. And on top of this, right, we also have ways of incorporating these support mechanisms into the interface itself. So thinking about, okay, if we automatically detect that the linguist is doing some behavior that we think that there's a better practice for, we can throw up a notification or throw up sort of a guidance that says, hey, did you know that you could do this in this particular way? And so what's really nice about this is that it's always kind of changing and evolving. And the best practice for yesterday might not be the same one for today or for tomorrow. And so we get to have these surveys that we run with our linguists, we get feedback, and then we're always trying to adjust, right? Because the goal is to make sure that we are making Lilt the sort of most intelligent localization platform that exists. And it's not, the goal is not, I am sitting here, I want this to be, the feature and it is so, right? That can't be it. And so these webinars, these interface nudges, and honestly, you can insert your next idea, right? There's multiple ways of supporting linguists as they're working in their workflow for translation. We can think about in-application onboarding. It's a complicated platform. How can we do sort of training on the fly if somebody just starts working at Lilt? We can think about improving concordance results and translation memory results that are more relevant to the document based on the content that's in the document, right? We can think about showing different suggestions for each of the words. I think I forgot to mention that the way that the suggestions are displayed is that they're always updating based on what the linguist is typing. So, based on the first 4 words, the first 2 words, or whatever you type, the machine translation algorithm takes that prefix or the things that you typed, and then it gives you the next best suggestion that it thinks you should type next, right? And so maybe that next word suggestion that the MT algorithm came up with isn't that great. Well, what about if there are alternatives, right? Will the linguist be able to choose from that? All in ways of, again, improving quality and making productivity gains. Okay, that said, I know I've been talking a bunch about, try to keep it at a high level for, showing you all what kind of projects that we work on. But I wanted to take some time to show you something that's a little bit more researchy, which is what happens if we think about tackling a problem and building a system that other people haven't really worked on, right? Coming up with a system that doesn't really exist. So this is an academic collaboration with a PhD student at the University of Michigan, Jordan Huffaker. And what we basically looked at is this problem where linguists are translating a lot of text, a lot of documents, but text can get really complicated really fast. And it's not just that, it gets complicated because it's technical terms or something, right? Language is very nuanced. So one word might mean something in context, right? In one particular context that it doesn't in another context. And so all of a sudden you have all of these different balancing acts as a translator to try to figure out, well, what word do I use? Or how do I translate this particular piece of text? So what do linguists do when that happens? And then based on that, like we want to sort of take advantage of the best of technology that there is. So then how do we bring that back to the platform, right? So these are sort of the 2 goals. And I guess there's like a little spoiler. We worked on this project that I'm going to talk about. We submitted our initial findings to this workshop called the Trust and Reliability in AI Teams workshop. That's going to be co-located with this conference called CHI. In case you're not aware, CHI is a sort of premier HCI conference, brings together people working on research topics that have a whole wide range. It's also sort of one of the largest and sort of premier workshops. So we're really excited to go show the work off there and get some ideas and sort of build a conversation around this whole human AI approach that we have at Lilt as well. So with that said, here's sort of an overview of what the project looks like, or looked like, I guess. There were 4 phases. We started off with understanding, right? And the way that we, that our research team at Lilt builds up the understanding, right, can be reading existing literature from what other people have studied and found out, looking at the world, but also specifically talking to linguists. So we conducted these contextual inquiries with 6 English to French linguists. And a contextual inquiry is an inquiry. So we ask a bunch of questions in context. So as the linguist was translating some text that we gave them, we were sort of watching them and their movements across the screen when they opened new tabs and went to Google or went to other places. And then we asked them questions. Why did you want to look up this particular word? When you had a bunch of alternatives, why did you pick this particular translation versus something else? And so now we got to ask all these questions while the linguist is working. And what this gives us is a better understanding of the mental model that the linguist has for how they're translating, but also what they do when they need to pick up more information. So based on all of this, we developed a new system that we incorporated into the existing Lilt interface. And then we deployed it to the real world because we have to be able to test to see if it worked, right? And so we recruited over 100 translators to run a user study with this system. And then finally, we sort of analyzed the results and shared the data. So the workshop paper is one part of it. And we're currently trying to write up a manuscript to share it with another conference. Okay, so one of the cool things that we found is that when the linguists are encountering words or phrases that they don't quite know how to translate from the start, there's a lot of different resources that they go to. Concordance sources, dictionaries, search engines, other MT tools, thesauruses. And so this entire ecosystem exists to help the linguists find the best translation that they can for that word or phrase. And given this is an example of what this looks like. You know, here's 2 sentences from a marketing document. And, you know, this is why translation is such a difficult task, right? It's really hard. There's a lot of words in here that have multiple meanings. Maybe, for instance, we didn't know what paddle was. Apparently it's a type of sport, right? Similar to tennis. But there's some phrases that are there that are idiomatic expressions, like turn on a dime. That this is something that might not easily translate to another language like French, right? Where that particular idiomatic expression might not exist. So when linguists, you know, face all of these issues as they're translating these documents, they exhibit a lot of these behaviors for building up context. And so, so for the next slide, Drew, this is something that we were able to, the one before that, I think. Yep. So this is something that was part of the study that we did that we're sort of, you know, wanting to share with the world in that workshop paper is behaviors for context building. There's a lot of reasons why translators engage in context building. It could be as simple as trying to find the official word or official translation. So it isn't just the case that they see a translation that showed up somewhere, but they want to go to, for instance, like the official English-French dictionary that the Canadian government has, right? That sort of resource has a lot of authority. There's also just things like brainstorming. Before you actually do translation, linguists want to know, what did other people do, right? What are some related words for this particular word or phrase that I'm looking at, so that I can just start, you know, kicking the tires on this translation. And one particular example of this, and this might be really obvious to you all that have done translation before this, is how words change depending on what context that they're being presented in, right? So here's a quote from one of our linguists when we interviewed them, and they were basically talking about the word weeder, right? So they were in the topic of, they were translating a document in scrapbooking. And so, you know, they were saying, I was not the first one to translate this word, but I was struggling with it because it's really specific vocabulary. So they really need to go and build up context around how to translate this word weeder. But, you know, the sentiment that they expressed is, you know, that term got me confused because I know what a weeder is in the gardening context, but they didn't know what that word meant for the scrapbooking context. And if you're a machine translation algorithm, you will need to train on a lot of data to be able to pick this nuance. But if for some reason you didn't get it, then all of a sudden the translator has to figure it out, right? So based on all of this information that we've uncovered, we built a system that sort of, this is stripped down version of that system because we needed to run a user study. But on the left, you can see the source sentence and the target sentence. On the right is where we provide all of this context that we've automatically sort of curated. So there's a lot of words that people were looking up in our contextual interviews. we curated a lot of this context where we went to Wikipedia, where we went to Google. We looked at alternative suggestions for each of these words, got Google images, right? The idea is that that slide, if you remember, where all of the different, that ecosystem for looking up this context, we sort of tried to bring a version of that into the Lilt interface and then tried to see, okay, what would this do for the context building behavior? If we give a set of new linguists these same documents, now with this context, what happens? And so you can see there's a lot of information that people can click through and we tried to sort of short circuit that searching process that linguists do and see how technology can help augment that, hopefully. So the sort of punchline then is we, like I said, we recruited over 100 participants, translators for this task. And this particular graph, I think, really helps to sort of explain what ended up happening. We had 4 different conditions for what translators saw. Some of them got to see that full context panel that you saw in the previous slide. Some of them didn't get anything except for just the source sentence and a blank text box. And then some linguists got to have a browser that they could go search. And then finally, some linguists got the context panel and the browser. So in case the information in the context panel wasn't enough, they could go search externally. So this is a really nice way of dividing up linguists so that we'll know exactly what the effect of the context panel was on the linguist sort of workflow as they're building up this information context. Okay, so what we see is that, we find that translators generally favored using the context panel. And what was really exciting is that depending on what word or phrase they were looking up and how difficult that word or phrase was, we could actually guide the translator's time that they used to build context towards those specific words or phrases, right? So the idea is that linguists can build up context for words that they kind of need, whereas they can end up relying more on the machine translation suggestions for words that are not as important or that aren't as critical. And I think what's really nice about this is that all of a sudden we have a way, just by providing all of this external context, we have a way of guiding linguists' effort. And so, in some of these conditions, we saw that linguists were spending time going to the browser that was built in to look up context for words or phrases that we didn't show context for, right? So maybe if there's a sentence, we picked 4 words that we thought would require context, but then we saw that linguists were looking up context in the browser for the other 6 that we didn't consider. And so what this is basically indicating to us is that the linguists that were using our tool sort of liked seeing the information for those 4 words. And because they value quality above all else, they wanted to get context for the others. So there's really cool opportunity for us to try to think about how can we actually provide all of this information for a lot of words, a lot of phrases, right? And take advantage of all of this effort that the linguists are building in the browser. But instead of them having to do all of that, we show information and linguists can then decide, oh, that's what paddle is, or, oh, I think this is the best translation for, a segment brace or something. So that's sort of, hopefully you got a good overview of one of these projects that we wanted to work on that was basically born out of this need for thinking about how to make linguists' lives easier when they encounter these words or phrases that they haven't really seen before or require a lot more nuance to translate. So if you're going to be in that conference, you know who to find. That's my little pitch for that conference.
What I find really fascinating about all of this is it's like this whole idea is making their linguist's life easier, but it's not just about making it so that they can do their jobs and be happy, which is a huge portion of this. It's also, and I think this actually leads into our next section here, but this is all impacting our end customers, our end users. It's not just for the linguists themselves. It's, once the linguists are able to become more efficient and use these these interface nudges and these new systems that we build, they get more efficient, they get more productive. And as a result, this all gets to market faster and it gets back to the customer faster. And going into global experience again. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, that's actually a great point, because one of the things about our neural machine translation models is that they learn based on what the linguists are typing and sort of the content, right? So you're totally right. These research projects that we're working on, it is obviously centered around the linguist, but it does affect the global experience, because the word that is really important, or that phrase that's really important in that marketing snippet that I showed you, turn on a dime, there is a very sort of literal way of translating that might not lead to the greatest experience if I am trying to buy a new shoe, right?
Sure.
If I'm reading this, it's a very literal thing. I'll be like, wait, what is currency doing here again? Whereas if the linguist is able to find that right context and figure out, oh, this is the phrase that I want to go with, it captures the same spirit. If I'm reading the description about that shoe, I can be like, oh yeah, like I can run really fast, right? Theoretically, I can run fast. I'll still buy the shoe, but it's one of these things that like really helps me to better understand the information that I'm seeing in context, in the language I care about.
Yeah.
I think that's what's cool.
Yeah, and that's a big portion of global experience. I kind of think of global experience as both, and what we have on the screen is just a handful of the various touch points that customers now have access to. When you go online and you're going to lilt.com, you'll see, before you even get there, you'll probably see some social media posts. Maybe you'll see a couple ads. That's the website. Maybe read a blog post. Hopefully you do, because the blog was great. Get some emails, see some customer reviews about people using Lilt, and so on and so forth. And there's so many different touch points that companies need to think about. And bringing that all back to what you've talked about this entire time, and this whole idea of research behind the scenes, is this research directly impacts how quickly you can take, as a company, you can take that source language and get it translated into all of these different other languages across all these different touch points. And beyond just getting to market, like you said, Sai, it's creating equal customer experiences for everyone. And I think that's a big, big part of this idea of global experiences. You shouldn't have your English-based, if you're an English-based company, you shouldn't have your English customer experience be 100% and all of the other languages be at like 60 to 70%. Because you're depriving your customers, you're depriving your users of the same experience and experiencing your brand and your company in the same way that everybody else is. So being able to, accurately, contextually understand the phrase turn on a dime may not seem like a big deal, but for the end user, for the end customer, it might, maybe it won't make or break their decision to buy the shoe, but it certainly will help them feel like they're a part of this, and it was created for them in the first place. So I wanted to put this up on screen because there are so many touch points, and it's easy to forget just how many things that are going on in this entire idea of global experience. And the more research that goes into all this, the faster and more productive linguists can be, the better it is across the entire funnel. So I know we're kind of over time, but I appreciate everybody sticking around. But I wanted to make sure we put this slide up on the screen because Sai, a lot of what you've talked about is research for specific parts of the Lilt platform, but Lilt goes, obviously you can see there's so many different aspects to our global experience platform. And we split it into global experience creation. How do you actually create and deploy these multilingual experiences? A lot of it, and I'm sure a lot of folks here understand generally the translate part of that, which is the actual engine that does all the work. And I would imagine a lot of the folks who use Lilt actually use the manage piece, which is actually, okay, great, you've gotten all that done. How do you manage that process? How do you improve it and scale it beyond that? But Sai, there's a lot of research that goes into all of this, not just what you've talked about so far.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, yeah, I was heavily biased towards the Translate part because I wanted to show off that project. But you know, really thinking about the research tools aren't just there when you want to work on projects that are unknown, right? Even looking at, you know, in the manage section, translation memories or term bases, or even something like style guides, right? If I were to translate a particular customer's content and I'm given a style guide that's like hundreds of pages long, it's going to be really difficult for me to actually adhere to it. Or it's going to take a long time before I can sort of download that reference into my head. So then research approaches can think about, okay, we have all of this information for how this particular customer wants their information to be translated. Here's a style guide. Here's a text specification. How do we bring that back into the interface? Or how can we do training with our linguists so that they can learn this better? So all of those quantitative approaches, qualitative approaches, these experiments can sort of, I'm going to be like, they're like feelers, right? They can put out in all these different components. And I think that's what's really exciting is because at this point, it wouldn't just be me on the team working on a project, it would be me with product, with production, and all of us sort of putting our heads together to try to think about, okay, what is like a really good way of approaching this problem?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's hugely important, like you said, beyond just Translate, it's across the board. And as this research continues to be done into all of these different parts, customers will, whether they use Lilt, and again, this research should be done across the board throughout the industry, no matter what. Like, this is not just something for Lilt, it's for the entire industry. But as people continue to use the platform, the research is a little bit indirect. Maybe they won't see, our customers may not see the research and its implications because it's for linguists, but there are plenty of things that they will see. And there are plenty of things that will improve their day-to-day workflows and their, yearly, annual workflows and just ability to manage and scale all their processes. So it is important. We obviously love the research team. We rely heavily on what you all are doing, and it's super important. So I hope that the folks on this call have been able to get a little bit of insight into what goes on behind the scenes and understand kind of how this all connects beyond just making sure our linguists can work quickly. So I know, like I said, I know we're well beyond time at this point. We do have a handful of questions. There's one that I want to quickly answer because I think it'll only take about 30 seconds. With the user interviews before, somebody was curious, what language we're conducting those interviews in?
For the ones that I've been conducting them, they're mostly in English. So a lot of the interviews are just in sort of, I talk in English with our English to French linguists. But then what's really cool is that if I ask a question about, for instance, turn on a dime is really in my head because I, growing up in an English speaking country, understand what that's supposed to say. But our French linguists were like, yeah, there's no direct equivalent to this. And so they would give me the French translations that are kind of close, but not quite exactly capturing that. But yeah, they're all done in English.
Yeah, we do have a huge team based in Germany that does a lot of amazing work out there. So, and teams based here, we've got teams all over the world, so you can't ever get away. But again, I know we have a handful of questions. So the folks that have asked questions, I will be sure to reach out and follow up to make sure you get all the answers that you need. But there are a lot of exciting things ahead. There are a lot of really cool things that the research team is doing to help really change this whole process. So want to just say thank you again to everybody who stayed on. I wish we had more time. I feel like we could talk about this topic for forever. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. If you do have any questions, definitely follow up, definitely reach out and ask. We're happy to talk about this stuff. Sai, thank you so much for joining today and sharing all of this. It's really interesting information, and I hope that folks on the call have learned a little bit about what's going on at Lilt. So with that, you follow us on social media. We have just under 10 days left of our State of Global Experience survey. So if you haven't taken a look, definitely check us out on LinkedIn. You'll see a link to the survey where you can help us learn about what's going on in the industry, and we're sharing on a big report like we did last year. So very excited for that. And otherwise, we hope you have a fantastic rest of the week, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you, everyone.